Welcome to Mint Vault USA, where today we're taking a closer look at 4 Jefferson nickels that may seem like ordinary old coins, but certain examples can become surprisingly interesting to collectors. These nickels have passed through millions of hands over the years, and some have developed unusual features, varieties, or minting characteristics that can make them worth far more than 5 cents. Stay with me as we uncover what collectors look for, why condition matters, and where the biggest surprises can appear. Now, let's start with the first coin. This first Jefferson nickel may look like a worn-out 5-cent coin that has simply spent too many years in circulation, but there is one detail that immediately makes it worth a closer look. We are talking about the 1948 Jefferson nickel with an S mint mark, and while the example in today's story is heavily circulated, its age, history, and mint origin make it an interesting coin for collectors to examine. The Jefferson nickel series began in 1938, replacing the Buffalo nickel that had been used for many years. The new design featured Thomas Jefferson on the obverse and his historic home, Monticello, on the reverse. Felix Schlag created the original design, and his work became one of the longest-running designs in American coinage. By 1948, the Jefferson nickel had already become a familiar part of everyday American life, and millions of examples were moving through stores, banks, vending machines, and cash registers. The S Mint mark tells us that this particular nickel was produced at the San Francisco Mint. That small letter appears on the reverse, near the Monticello design, and it is one of the first things collectors check when identifying an older Jefferson nickel. San Francisco produced many important coins throughout American history, and mint marks can help collectors separate coins made at different facilities during the same year. The 1948 issue is especially interesting because it came just a few years after the special wartime composition used for Jefferson nickels had ended. During World War II, nickel was considered an important strategic metal, so the mint changed the composition of the 5-cent coin between 1942 and 1945. By 1948, the traditional copper and nickel composition had returned, giving this coin a direct connection to the period immediately following one of the most unusual chapters in Jefferson nickel history. The example we're looking at today is heavily circulated, and that condition is impossible to ignore. Years of handling have softened the highest points of Jefferson's portrait, while the reverse shows wear across Monticello and the surrounding lettering. Small scratches, contact marks, and dull surfaces are natural results of a coin spending decades in circulation. To someone unfamiliar with collecting, the heavy wear might make the coin appear unimportant, but collectors know that condition is only one part of the story. The first thing worth checking is authenticity and the basic details. Make sure the date really reads 1948, then confirm the S Mint mark on the reverse. After that, the surfaces deserve a closer examination. Collectors may look for doubled lettering, unusual die characteristics, die cracks, chips, or other mint-made features that could separate an ordinary example from an unusual one. A genuine double die is particularly interesting because it is created during the die-making process rather than simply being caused by the coin receiving a second strike. The doubling should have a specific appearance and location, so collectors should be careful not to mistake ordinary machine doubling, damage, or scratches for a true doubled die. This is where magnification and comparison with known examples can become extremely useful. Reverse deserves just as much attention. Look closely around the lettering, the building details, and the mint mark area. Damage accumulated during circulation can create lines and shapes that look unusual at first glance, but a genuine mint error should have characteristics consistent with the way coins are manufactured. That is why experienced collectors compare questionable coins with reference photographs and established variety information before deciding that they have found something special. There is also something fascinating about the history behind a heavily circulated 1948 nickel. Think about where this little coin could have traveled during its lifetime. It may have been used to buy a newspaper, pay for a small purchase at a local shop, or sit inside a cash register while generations of people passed through the same business. It could have crossed state lines many times before eventually ending up in an old collection or coin jar. That history gives circulated coins a special character. They may not have the bright surfaces of an untouched mint state example, but they carry evidence of real life. Every worn area represents years of contact with other coins and human hands. For collectors who enjoy the historical side of numismatics, that can make even a heavily worn nickel worth studying. Now comes the part that gets collectors especially interested, the question of value. A normal heavily circulated 1948 Jefferson nickel is not automatically a rare fortune coin simply because it is old. Its value depends on factors such as condition, eye appeal, originality, scarcity, and whether it has a recognized variety or genuine mint era. A worn example with no unusual characteristics will generally remain a modest collectible. But an important variety can completely change the conversation. A genuine mint era or recognized scarce variety can attract much more attention than an ordinary example, especially when the feature is clear and has been confirmed by specialists. High-quality certified examples can also bring stronger prices because collectors know exactly what they are buying. For the most exceptional Jefferson nickels, values can climb into the thousands of dollars, and rare era or variety coins can sometimes command substantially more when rarity and collector demand meet. That is where the excitement comes from, not from assuming every 1948 nickel is valuable, but from understanding that the right combination of date, mint mark, variety, condition, and authentication can create a very different collecting story. Imagine finding one of these old nickels in a box that belonged to a family member. It looks dark and worn, and you almost put it back without thinking. Then you notice the 1948 date. You turn it over and see the small S mint mark. Instead of moving on, you decide to compare the lettering and design with another Jefferson nickel. Suddenly, an ordinary 5-cent coin becomes something worth researching. That moment of discovery is what keeps this hobby alive. You do not need to be an expert to begin looking. You simply need to slow down, learn the basic features, and understand what makes one coin different from another. The 1948 Jefferson nickel is a perfect example of why old coins deserve a second look, even when circulation has left them heavily worn. And remember, never assume that every unusual mark is an error. Environmental damage, scratches, cleaning, corrosion, and ordinary wear can all change the appearance of a coin. The goal is to learn the difference between damage and a genuine mint-made characteristic. When a questionable feature appears, careful comparison and professional authentication can make all the difference. So if you come across a heavily circulated 1948 Jefferson nickel with an S mint mark, don't immediately dismiss it because of its worn appearance. Check the date, study the mint mark, examine both sides under good lighting, and pay close attention to anything that looks different from a normal example. It may turn out to be an ordinary old nickel, but the search itself is part of what makes coin collecting so exciting. The second Jefferson nickel in today's countdown has one small detail that can make collectors stop and look twice, because sometimes the absence of a mint mark is exactly what deserves attention. We are looking at the 1954 Jefferson nickel without a mint mark, and this particular example is circulated with a dark, almost black shade across parts of the surface. At first glance, the worn appearance may make it seem unimportant, but its date and mint mark details give collectors a reason to examine it carefully. The 1954 Jefferson nickel was produced during an important period in the history of the series. America was moving deeper into the post-war years, and the 5-cent coin had returned to its traditional composition after the special wartime nickels of the early 1940s. Millions of Jefferson nickels were needed for everyday commerce, so the United States Mint continued producing them at different facilities. The absence of a mint mark is an important detail here. A 1954 Jefferson nickel without a mint mark was made at the Philadelphia Mint, which did not place a mint mark on its coins during this period. That means the missing letter is not automatically an error. In fact, for a normal Philadelphia example, no mint mark is exactly what collectors should expect to see. Understanding this difference is important, because coin collecting is often about knowing what should be there before deciding that something is missing. The obverse carries the familiar portrait of Thomas Jefferson, while the reverse shows Monticello, the famous Virginia home associated with Jefferson. The design was created by Felix Schlag and had already become a well-known part of American coinage by the 1950s. On this circulated example, years of handling have softened some of the finer details, while the dark surface shade gives the coin an unusual appearance. The black coloration, however, should not automatically be treated as a valuable mint error. Dark toning can develop naturally as metal reacts with its environment, and coins that have been stored in poor conditions can develop heavy discoloration, residue, or other surface changes. Environmental damage may make a coin look dramatic, but collectors generally separate that type of damage from genuine mint-made errors. This is where careful examination becomes important. A collector might compare the lettering, Jefferson's portrait, the date, and Monticello with another 1954 Philadelphia nickel. If something appears unusual, the next step is to determine whether the feature was created at the mint or developed after the coin entered circulation. Collectors can also search this date for recognized die varieties, double design elements, die cracks, chips, and unusual striking characteristics. Not every unusual mark qualifies as an error, but genuine mint-made features can make a coin considerably more interesting to specialists. The value story is also very different between an ordinary circulated example and a truly exceptional specimen. A worn 1954 Philadelphia nickel with dark environmental toning is generally not a major rarity simply because of its appearance. However, examples with recognized varieties, genuine mint errors, or exceptional preservation can attract much stronger demand. In the right combination of rarity and condition, standout Jefferson nickels from this era can reach values in the thousands of dollars, with exceptional specimens sometimes commanding prices far beyond what an ordinary circulated example would bring. That is what makes this hobby so fascinating. A coin can look dark, worn, and forgotten, yet still deserve a careful examination because its date, mint origin, and possible variety can tell a much bigger story. The important lesson is not to assume that every black or discolored nickel is valuable, but also not to throw an old coin aside before checking its details. So if you find a 1954 Jefferson nickel without a mint mark, look closely at the date and design, then study the surfaces under good lighting. Compare it with known examples, and if you believe you have discovered something unusual, consider having the coin examined by an experienced dealer or professional grading service. Now we come to Jefferson nickel from 1964, a year that carries a fascinating place in American coin history. The coin is a 1964 D Jefferson nickel, and the example we're looking at has been heavily circulated and shows the kind of worn, aged appearance that can make an old coin easy to overlook. But this is exactly the sort of nickel that deserves a closer inspection, because the 1960s were a very important period for United States coinage. By 1964, the country was dealing with major changes in the nation's coin supply. The rising demand for circulating money, along with shortages of silver in other denominations, placed enormous pressure on the United States Mint. Jefferson nickels remained an important part of everyday commerce, and the Denver Mint produced large quantities of them to help keep 5-cent coins moving through the economy. The small D mint mark on the reverse identifies this example as a Denver issue. The design itself is familiar to almost every American collector, with Thomas Jefferson appearing on the obverse and Monticello featured prominently on the reverse. On a heavily circulated example like this one, the finer details can become softer, and years of contact can leave scratches, dull areas, and small marks across the surfaces. There is another reason collectors find the 1964 Jefferson nickel interesting, and it comes from the enormous production numbers associated with the date. When a coin is produced in very large quantities, most ordinary examples will not be rare. That means the date alone does not automatically make a circulated 1964 D nickel valuable. Instead, collectors start looking for something that separates a normal example from an unusual one. That might be a recognized die variety, a genuine double die, a strong die crack, an unusual die break, or a dramatic striking error. Some collectors also pay close attention to the lettering and the small design details around Monticello, because these areas can sometimes reveal characteristics that are difficult to notice without magnification. The condition of today's example creates an interesting contrast. It is heavily worn, so it would not compete with a brilliant uncirculated nickel based on condition alone. However, collectors do not always search for perfect surfaces. If a heavily circulated coin contains a genuine and desirable mint-made error, that error can become the main reason for its collector interest. This is an important lesson for anyone searching through old nickels. Never assume that a worn coin has nothing to offer. At the same time, never assume that every scratch, dent, or unusual line is a mint error. Circulation damage can create plenty of strange-looking features, and learning to separate damage from genuine mint characteristics is one of the most valuable skills a beginner can develop. Imagine finding this 1964D nickel in a jar that has been sitting untouched for years. Its surface is dull, the portrait has lost much of its original detail, and the reverse looks heavily used. You might be tempted to put it straight back into the jar. But then you notice something unusual near the lettering, or perhaps a feature around the date that does not look quite right. That small observation gives you a reason to compare the coin with another 1964D nickel. This is where coin hunting becomes exciting. You are no longer simply looking at an old 5-cent piece. You are studying how it was made, how it changed during circulation, and whether anything about it separates it from the millions of normal examples that were produced. When it comes to value, a heavily circulated 1964D Jefferson nickel without a recognized variety or error is generally not a major rarity. However, the situation can change dramatically when a genuine and desirable mint-made characteristic is confirmed. Strong varieties, major errors, and exceptional certified examples can attract serious collector interest, and standout Jefferson nickels from the period can reach values in the thousands of dollars when rarity and demand come together. That is why collectors continue examining these old nickels instead of judging them only by their appearance. A worn surface may tell us that the coin spent decades in circulation, but it does not tell the entire story. The date, mint mark, variety, error status, and authenticity all have to be considered before a collector can understand what the coin is really worth. The 1964D Jefferson nickel is therefore a great example of a coin where knowledge matters more than appearance. Most examples are ordinary, but the right discovery can turn an otherwise familiar nickel into something much more interesting. And because so many old Jefferson nickels remain in collections and forgotten containers, there are still plenty of opportunities for careful collectors to examine them today. The final Jefferson nickel in today's countdown comes from 1965, and there is one detail about this coin that can easily cause confusion, especially for someone who is just beginning to search older nickels. This is a 1965 Jefferson nickel with no mint mark, and the example we're discussing is heavily circulated with a worn, aged appearance. It may not look impressive sitting in your hand, but the story behind this date makes it a coin worth understanding before you decide to spend it or put it back into a jar. The mid-1960s were a difficult period for American coin production. The United States was facing a serious shortage of circulating coins, and the mint was working hard to increase production. Changes were also taking place in the composition of several U.S. denominations because of the rising cost and shortage of silver. The Jefferson nickel continued to use its own composition, but production was heavily focused on meeting the country's growing demand for coins. One detail makes the 1965 issue especially interesting: the absence of a mint mark. Unlike many earlier Jefferson nickels, 1965 nickels were produced without mint marks as part of a broader mint policy during this period. Coins made at Philadelphia and Denver could therefore appear without the familiar P or D that collectors normally use to identify their origin. This means the missing mint mark on a 1965 nickel is not automatically an error, and that is an important point for anyone searching through old change. The coin itself carries the classic Jefferson design that collectors have known for generations. Thomas Jefferson appears on the obverse, while Monticello is shown on the reverse. On a heavily circulated example, years of handling can soften Jefferson's hair and facial details, while the building and lettering on the reverse may also show noticeable wear. Scratches and contact marks can add to the worn appearance, especially on a coin that spent many years moving through everyday transactions. But here is where the search becomes more interesting. Collectors do not stop with the date and mint mark. They examine the coin for unusual characteristics that may have been created during production. A strong double die, an unusual die crack, a dramatic die break, or a significant striking error could make an otherwise ordinary 1965 nickel much more interesting. At the same time, beginners need to be careful. A heavily circulated coin can develop scratches, dents, flattening, stains, and other marks that may look unusual under magnification. Those features are usually the result of use or environmental exposure, not mistakes made at the mint. Learning that difference can save a collector from confusing damage with a genuine error. The 1965 nickel also has an interesting connection to the larger story of American coin collecting. During periods of heavy coin demand, enormous numbers of coins were produced and released into circulation. People used them without thinking about their future collector value. A nickel could have passed through a grocery store, a gas station, a movie theater, or a vending machine before disappearing into someone's pocket again. Decades later, some of those same coins are being pulled from old jars and family collections. A collector may notice the 1965 date, see the missing mint mark, and wonder whether the coin is unusual. In this case, knowing the history of the mint is extremely important because the absence of a mint mark is expected on regular 1965 Jefferson nickels. The real opportunity comes from finding something beyond the normal characteristics. And that brings us to value. A heavily circulated 1965 Jefferson nickel without a mint mark is generally not rare simply because it lacks a mint mark. Its worn condition also limits its value as a normal collectible. However, a genuine rare variety or significant mint error can change the picture completely. Collectors are willing to pay much more for coins with confirmed characteristics that are genuinely scarce, especially when the feature is dramatic and the coin can be authenticated. For a truly exceptional Jefferson nickel connected with a rare variety or major error, prices can rise into the thousands of dollars, and the most desirable certified pieces can command substantially more when serious collectors compete for them. That is why an old 1965 nickel should not be judged only by its 5-cent face value, but it should also not be treated as a guaranteed treasure simply because it is old. The real lesson from this final coin is simple. Look closely, learn the history, and verify what you find. If you have a 1965 Jefferson nickel, check the date and examine both sides under good lighting. Look for unusual design details, but remember that scratches and circulation damage are not automatically valuable errors. If something genuinely unusual appears, compare it with trusted references or have the coin examined by a qualified professional. There is also an important rule for preserving old Jefferson nickels. Never clean them in an attempt to make them look newer. Cleaning can leave scratches or remove the original surface and may reduce collector appeal. Instead, keep the coin in a safe, inert holder. Avoid touching the surfaces unnecessarily and protect it from moisture and harsh chemicals. If you believe you have discovered a significant variety or error, professional services such as PCGS or NGC can provide authentication and grading. Looking back at all 4 Jefferson nickels in today's countdown, each one tells a different story. The 1948 S takes us into the post-war years and gives us a chance to study an older San Francisco issue. The 1954 Philadelphia nickel reminds us why understanding mint marks is so important. The 1964 D shows how a heavily produced coin can still become interesting when a genuine variety or error is involved. And the 1965 nickel takes us into the unusual mint mark period of the mid-1960s. Most of these coins will not turn into life-changing treasures, and that is perfectly normal. The excitement comes from knowing exactly what to look for and recognizing the difference between an ordinary coin and a truly unusual one. Sometimes the most important discovery is not a huge price tag, but the moment you realize that you have found something that deserves further investigation. So before you spend that old Jefferson nickel, take a second look at the date, the mint details, and the surfaces. You never know what story a small 5-cent coin might be carrying, and one of these old nickels could be hiding in your home right now, waiting for someone to notice it.